Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this vital event, the future of Arctic collaboration at the Crossroads. My name is Ole Øbertveit, and I'm working as a project manager and researcher at the University of Bergen. It's a privilege to be here with such a distinguished group of scientists, experts, and policymakers dedicated to understanding and safeguarding the Arctic, a region that not only holds profound significance for the people and ecosystem within it, but also for the entire planet. The Arctic is at the pivotal moment in history, warming nearly 4 times faster than the global average. It stands as both a warning and a roadmap for addressing the interconnected crisis for climate change, biodiversity loss, and geopolitical tension. But today we gather not just to reflect on these challenges, but to chart a way forward for collaboration, innovation, and equitable governance in the Arctic. This event is hosted under the UArctic-founded project Rethinking Arctic Collaboration, led by a consortium of institutions including the University of Bergen, the Alfred Wegener Institute, Nord University, and Dartmouth College, among others. The project's mission is clear: to understand the current state of Arctic research and science diplomacy while facilitating new frameworks for sustainable, ethical, and impactful collaboration. The need for such effort has never been more urgent. Recent geopolitical events, including Russia's invasion of Ukraine, have disrupted long-standing scientific partnerships. The Arctic Council, long a beacon of international collaboration, faces unprecedented challenges to its authority and structure. As we approach the 5th International Polar Year in 2032-33, we are presented with the unique opportunity to rethink how Arctic science diplomacy can thrive and improve in an increasingly fractured world. A key question we face today is what kind of collaboration is not only desirable but achievable in this rapidly evolving landscape. In just a few months, Denmark and Greenland will assume the Arctic Council chairmanship. A challenging role in a region increasingly shaped by geopolitical tension, including an unpredictable and assertive US presence. Yet we must remain hopeful that the Arctic Council can navigate these turbulent waters and continue to thrive. How can we safeguard the integrity of knowledge production amidst these challenges? And how do we ensure that equity and ethics are firmly embedded in Arctic science, making it both impactful and relevant? It's important to acknowledge that collaboration in the Arctic is not just about government and institutions, it's about people. Scientists, indigenous communities, policymakers, and other stakeholders who live and work in this fragile environment. The inclusion of indigenous knowledge and perspectives, for instance, must be more than symbolic. It must be central to how we frame policies, conduct research, and envision the Arctic's future. One of the defining features of Arctic exceptionalism is the inclusion of indigenous voices at the policy level, exemplified by the membership of 6 indigenous organizations in the Arctic Council since its inception. This underscores the importance of celebrating the efforts, particularly by the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in keeping the Arctic Council alive and functioning during these challenging times. As we move into today's discussion, I encourage us all to think boldly and creatively. How can we safeguard the Arctic's unique role as a hub for peaceful knowledge-informed politics while adapting to the realities of a multipolar world? How can we translate the lessons of the past, such as the successes of prior international polar years, into frameworks that are resilient, inclusive, and action-oriented? What role should relative newcomers at the Arctic stage, like the EU, play? Today's panelists brings diverse expertise and perspectives on these critical questions, from their work in science diplomacy and international relations to their on-the-ground expertise in Arctic research. They are uniquely positioned to help us navigate this complex landscape. So, let us begin the dialogue with open minds, a spirit of collaboration, a shared commitment to ensuring that the Arctic remains not just a region of great significance, but a model for the kind of global cooperation we so urgently need. Melody Berkens is the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies at Dartmouth and a Arctic Chair of Science Diplomacy and Inclusion. And with over 30 years of experience, she is a leading advocate for sustainable inclusion and gender equality in Arctic science and policy. Melody, as far as the Arctic faces increasing global turmoil, what key element must we safeguard for its resilience and sustainability?
Thank you, Ulla, and thank you all for being here. I have a little bit of a little frog in my throat. The piece that I'll just to build on what Ulla said is that we need to, we call this rethinking Arctic collaboration, but we're really, as we've been talking, it is reinvesting in the processes and the norms of the Arctic Council. And so as we face all of these challenges, what are the key elements that we must safeguard? For us, for me, and I hope many others on the panel, it is not just what we do together, but it's the process of how we have been doing it. And it is that integrity of knowledge co-production that informs polar policy and diplomacy. It's striving, and still not doing well enough, but striving to the ethical and equitable engagement that the Arctic indigenous peoples have demanded and should, which makes more effective and holistic and knowledgeable Arctic policy. And how do we do that? We have to continue and make sure that the norms of the Arctic Council are not just in the Arctic Council. How do we make sure that the Arctic Council is strong, but those norms infect others? We just spent, the Arctic Youth Council was here last week, and we had some sessions with the Gordon Foundation from Canada, a wonderful US-Canada partnership. And we're teaching the skills that we think are so important, which are building skills for consensus negotiation. A lot of young people in early career don't learn about how you can work through consensus negotiation. That's hard. It takes longer. It's negotiation at the speed of trust. But those are skills that we need to make sure stay in the Arctic Council and are moved to other places where Arctic policy is discussed. And we have to make sure that knowledge co-production is prioritized across diverse knowledge systems. Again, this is not easy work. It's not how I was trained as a climate scientist. I'm sure many of you in the sciences or in any academic field, this was not in our training. But that is what is demanded by norms and institutions such as the Arctic Council. And how do we make sure we, again, bring the how up to the fore, and that is how we strengthen the Arctic Council and we strengthen the knowledge that goes into Arctic policy. Finally, on Arctic science diplomacy, let me say that I'm very adamant that Arctic science diplomacy, if science diplomats from around the world are writing norms that are about how we talk about science, and we talk about science across disciplines, and we have diplomacy with different groups around the world, but it's still wholly deficient for Arctic science diplomacy, where again, the two things I just mentioned, science has to be the co-production of knowledge. So Arctic science diplomacy does not exist without the co-production of knowledge. And then the diplomacy part is not just about people meeting in government halls. It's about recognizing the diplomacy of Arctic communities, Arctic indigenous leaders, recognizing the sovereignty of those spaces. So Arctic science diplomacy and the Arctic Council have norms to be set that are very powerful. It's how we do it, and the outcome is powerful, but we need to protect those and safeguard them.
Thank you, Melody. A follow-up question. You mentioned the Arctic Council, and you're an American. No, I'm kidding. But it's fantastic to see the Arctic Council, as we have talked about, is now operational. But how do you see its role and importance evolving in the coming years and decades?
Ola always does this to me. Well, by some of my definitions, if the U.S. continues at this pace, if it does not recognize sovereignty, if it does not bring and practice knowledge co-production and respect of ethical and equitable engagement, I would have a hard time with my U.S. folks being. They need to. If those are the norms to behave in the Arctic Council, then I hope that the U.S. will acknowledge that its engagement with the Arctic Council needs to have those as its basis. Otherwise, it is not fair to anyone in the Arctic Council. I'm saying this a little bit off the fly. It's been a rough week. But that's what the future of the Arctic Council needs. People uphold those norms, uphold the respect and the trust that has been built, and we can't just give in. It really has to be strong by those of us in the U.S. and around the world. And if it's not going to come from some leadership in the U.S., then we need to find our partners and maintain that network in different ways.
Thank you very much, Melody. Anders Oskal is the Secretary General of the Association of World Reindeer Herders and Executive Director of the International Center for Reindeer Husbandry. A reindeer herding Sami from northern Norway, Anders is a champion for indigenous perspectives in Arctic innovation and sustainability. And Anders, how have recent geopolitical disruptions, such as Russia's isolation from Arctic collaborations, impacted indigenous representation and participation in global Arctic discussions?
First, thanks for the invite to this timely and important discussion. Now, of course, World Reindeer Herders represent 35 years of collaboration between the nomadic indigenous peoples of the Arctic. It started in 1990, was solidified here in Tromsø in 1993, the first time we brought together all the indigenous reindeer herding peoples in Fokus Kino in this town, supported strongly by the Norwegian government and the Russian Federation. It was a different time, of course. We became an observer formally to the Arctic Council in 2000, after having been an ad hoc observer for some years before that. And through the Arctic Council, by recommendations of the Arctic Council, the Norwegian government established and funded the International Center for Reindeer Husbandry from 2005. Now, of course, our reality as reindeer herders is that we have had no say in what has transpired as of late in international politics, but we are very much impacted by it. It is not by choice of reindeer herders that things have happened and transpired as they have. I would like to remind us, we talk about the Arctic Council, but I would like to remind everyone that the collaboration between the indigenous peoples of the Arctic goes way back to 1973. So for over 50 years now, we've had collaboration between the different groups of indigenous peoples in the Arctic that are also at stake at these times. And the Arctic, well, can you talk about the Arctic without the territory of the Russian Federation? No. So this is a bit of a challenge. To bring us back a little bit to the 80s. So there were, if you imagine the polar ocean around the North Pole, there were two huge slabs of ice floating. On one of them, was the late Dr. Bob Correll, for whom we have the deepest respect as a science diplomat. It was the T3 project of researching Arctic ice from the Americans. But there was another one that had a floating lab, as they called it. On that one were the Russians with Artur Chelangarov. Now, it just so happened that the iceberg on which Chelangarov was staying was melting. And it became a life-threatening situation. And through back channels between the KGB and CIA on a street in Paris, the messages were exchanged so that Chelangarov and his team was saved. Now, of course, Bob and Chelangarov had completely different philosophies in terms of politics, but they became friends for life. And those type of relationships also helped form the fourth polar year. It changed in many ways the polar year. And that gave us, ranger hunters and indigenous peoples, also protection to work during a time. Of course, this was a fairly peaceful time in the Arctic, we could say 2008, 2007, 2008. But the fourth polar year will always be remembered for the strategic decision of including the social dimension, and by that also including indigenous issues. Regrettably, we must say that while we took part in the fourth polar year and its preparation and its solidification by the Arctic Council, we have not been included in the work, certainly not in Norway, which is we must regret. I want to also say a few words about sanctions. Now, we all understand why we have sanctions. The backdrop is, of course, serious. But in our experience, those who are hit first and hardest by sanctions, the impacts of sanctions, are the ones who are last in line to begin with. In our case, ranger hunters. We still have a project that is on a, let's say, frozen list of projects in the UN after the Crimean invasion in 2014. $5 million on an account in Washington, D.C., which we are not able to touch. This was supposed to go to strengthen and save the very vulnerable taiga ranger herding in eastern Siberia, Mongolia, and China. So the point is that while sanctions have effects, we don't really have any mechanisms to handle the unintended effects of sanctions, which is very real. Some of you may have heard of IASA in Vienna, which was created by Johnson and Gromyko to have a place for the US in particular and Russia to talk together. Another challenge is that we have fewer and fewer spaces for that to happen today. IASA sort of disappeared off the radar. So there are many things to be said, but seeing as how the international collaboration of indigenous peoples predate that, even that of the Arctic Council, and seeing as how we as indigenous peoples have been on our territories before even the concept of national states was invented, there has been discussions in the UN about a general exception from sanctions for indigenous peoples, as indigenous people should not be punished for the conflicts between states. As for now, it hasn't manifested into anything substantial, but in the time we live in, the impossible seems suddenly to be possible. So we will see. And finally, just to say that when we talk about science diplomacy, let's think a little bit wider. There is also another form of knowing, another way of knowing, indigenous knowledge. And so it must be respected, at the very least. It may not need to be understood, but it must be respected. You must respect that you do not understand it. For those of you who have seen the big tent outside here, it's our indigenous food lab, which we have brought here for food diplomacy reasons. We plan to bring it also to Greenland. Greenland are in need of diplomacy as we speak. Let's just say, we mean it very seriously. Give a room also for the indigenous diplomacy of the Arctic. It can only bring us further.
Thank you. And yeah, we will return to many of the issues that you have addressed, not least the past, and looking into the future. What can we take with us from the past? But as we rethink Arctic collaboration, what role should indigenous diplomacy and knowledge play in shaping the next decades of Arctic science and policy framework?
Well, as said, first, please understand there is another knowledge system. And we find great pleasure in teasing, especially our natural scientist friends, by saying that you should remember that while we were herding reindeer up north, while science still thought the world was flat. And it's fun, but it doesn't really bring us further, does it? So I think a good step would be if we would stop, all of us, to pretend that we have a perfect knowledge system, because that does not bring us any further. We need, rather, when we look at the Arctic horizon in front of us, we need to use the best available knowledge to find answers. And what is the best available knowledge? Well, science has been and will be even more important in the future. But there is the other way of knowing, indigenous knowledge, that needs to be respected. And of course, for that reason alone, I think it's fair to say that we should all have some concern for the future of the Arctic Council, as that has been really a pioneering platform to have a true inclusion of this other way of knowing. So that should be a matter of concern to more than just indigenous peoples, because we know a few things about the areas in which we have lived.
Thank you. Volker Rackhold is the head of the German Arctic office at the Alfred Wegener Institute, where he brings science, politics, and industry together. A geochemist with extensive experience, Volker has led numerous Arctic expeditions and previously served as executive secretary of the International Arctic Science Committee. Volker, what is the future of Arctic science cooperation, and what will its primary drivers and be in an increasingly fragmented world?
I think you've picked the most difficult questions for me, or is that
Yeah,
true?
I did.
Ole? Okay, so yeah, that's a hard one. I mean, I think I would start with saying, first of all, we have to keep in mind what we want and what is realistic, and that's a very different thing. And I think we should probably go back to history and see how international cooperation in the Arctic started, actually. And at the end of the day, everything was triggered by the famous Gorbachev speech in Murmansk, where he talked about security, he talked about the environment, and he talked about science, and that the Arctic countries should have a mechanism to cooperate. Before, actually, there was not really international cooperation in science in the Arctic. It was bilateral things, but not really international. But that triggered a discussion of the Arctic states, and then led to the formation of the International Arctic Science Committee and the Arctic Council at the end. So the two important bodies, and they, of course, then initiated really international cooperation in the Arctic. But the point is, there was some political will behind it. And that's a thing which is maybe a bit different today. So, and then, I mean, there were enormously important initiatives. And one thing that I think was really changing the Arctic was the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment. It's something that also Bob Correll was leading. Because that was for the first time that people realized, okay, there's something happening in the Arctic. So the Arctic is changing dramatically. And that was then also kind of one of the driving elements for science, because people understood, okay, the Arctic is changing much faster than the rest of the world, and the consequences for the Arctic, but also for the rest of the world, are dramatic. So, And then, I mean, we can name many things like that. Another thing that I would like to mention is the Arctic Science Ministerial meetings. So there were 3 Arctic Science Ministerial meetings that brought together the science ministers from all the countries doing Arctic research, of course, including Russia, including everyone. And that was extremely important. So another thing that I want to mention is the famous Mosaic expedition that my institute organized some years ago, with our icebreaker sitting in the Arctic Ocean for a full year, during the pandemic actually, and it still worked, also because Russia was very supportive, and without Russia this wouldn't work. So, but now we are in a different situation. Just give as an example the German Arctic policy guidelines that were just published half a year ago that clearly state Germany does not consider Russia a partner in Arctic research. And I think we are not the only ones. I think this is the same for many countries. Of course, there are countries that cooperate with Russia, like China still does and India does. But for many countries, this is impossible at the moment. So, which of course means that a ministerial meeting is not possible, something like Mosaic is not possible at the moment. But nevertheless, of course, there is scientific cooperation. So IASC, for example, still has Russian members. Yeah? The Arctic Council working groups, they also now working together with Russia again. So I think what we need to do is we need to look at what is possible. Or let's say World Meteorological Organization, for example, they also have Russians on board. So there are things that work, and there are things that don't work. So, and I think maybe our approach would have to be to look into things that are possible and try to avoid those things that are not possible. The other issue that we have, and which could become equally difficult and challenging, and you mentioned it already, Ole, is of course the situation in the United States. And this is I think the driving thing for our scientists to look at the Arctic is, of course, that the Arctic is warming much faster than the rest of the globe, 4 times faster, and of course these are consequences. But now people start questioning climate change, or even denying or ignoring climate change. This driving instrument isn't there anymore. Yeah? And so we will have to see what happens, especially now with Denmark or Greenland taking over the chairmanship. If you buy Greenland, what does it mean for the Arctic Council? Yeah? So there are many uncertainties, and I think it's really hard to give a concrete answer to your question, Will.
It's still difficult to predict the future. But what I would also like to just to hear your opinion on is the fact that more science funding comes from non-Arctic states than from Arctic states, and increasing number of these are run by non-democratic governments. Do you have any thoughts on what implications this might have on Arctic science and how it's conducted and the purpose of it?
That's another good question. I mean, that's maybe the third element that we see, in addition to Russia and the situation in the US. I think it's a growing economic interest in the Arctic, so that much of the scientific activities that we are seeing in the Arctic are not purely scientific interest. They are also trying to open the back door for economic activities. And of course, this is also coming not only from the Arctic states, but in particular also from non-Arctic states. So, I mean, shipping is a topic since years already. The resources in Greenland are a topic since years. And of course, this is now even getting more important with the global political situation that we have. Resources is becoming a topic again. And seeing the new US policy, of course, drill baby drill, of course that also applies to the Arctic. So,
yeah, thank you. Okay, Jenny Baseman is an international consultant in science, policy and climate. She is the founding director of the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists and has held leadership roles in major polar research organizations with a career shaped by a passion for the cryosphere. So Jenny, with IPY5 approaching, and you both worked were central in the IPY4. How can the 5th International Polar Year serve as a game changer for Arctic science collaboration and what lessons can we draw from past international polar years?
Well, thanks. The International Polar Years, so there's been 4. The first one was in 1882, involved 12 countries, mostly Arctic, looking at meteorology, geophysics, and the auroras. I think this was the first time that international science cooperation actually happened. So that's a great model. The polar regions, again, lead the way in showing the world that international cooperation is important. They didn't do such a great job at keeping track of the data, which is a problem we had in IPY4 as well. The second International Polar Year was in 1932. That was 40 nations and both poles. Mainly atmospheric processes were the concentration. They discovered the stratosphere during that polar year, enhanced our knowledge of mapping the different polar regions, and lots of new technologies, including radiosondes, were used. The third IPY, which I think many people realize is the International Geophysical Year, 60 nations, again, both poles. Lots of amazing things came out of the IGY. We advanced our space studies by finding the Van Allen radiation belts, launched the first artificial satellites. It was the first time we had a comprehensive exploration of the continent of Antarctica. For those of you who, I have one thing in common with Sir Edmund Hillary, in that we both have driven Massey Ferguson tractors. He, however, has driven one to the South Pole. I have not. But that was the first time that anyone had driven a vehicle to the South Pole. And so that was a great advancement there in glaciology, seismology. Also laid the foundation for much of the climate work that we still base our things off of today. Perhaps the biggest achievement I think that we often go back to is the launch or the creation of the Antarctic Treaty, which set the continent of Antarctica for peace and for science. So the IPY 3 was instrumental. IPY 4 from 2007 to 2008, and I see a lot of people in this room were part of that fantastic adventure. More than 60 nations, both poles, over 225 projects. So it was by far the largest international field campaign of ever. So again, the polar regions and polar scientists lead the way. And again, as Anders said, it was the first time indigenous people were involved and thought of and involved, right? Engaged, as well as social sciences in general. Another big part of the IPY4 was that education and outreach, communicating our science was part of every single project, and a huge push that we can't just sit in our academic worlds and read our journals. We have to get out there and tell people what we're doing and why it's important. As we say, what happens at the poles doesn't stay at the poles. So the education and outreach was a very important thing. Of course, the creation of APEX, the Association of Polar Early Career Scientists, where young researchers could have meaningful opportunities early in their career to get involved in international work, was a great invention. There's a lot of us involved in that. And I think as society has changed, it's important that young people have that kind of opportunity, because that's another form of diversity and inclusion. Integration of all disciplines. It was very international and interdisciplinary, and I think quite an achievement in that and of itself. Of course, there's a lot of things we can do to improve on that for the next IPY. Data, I think we failed on data management, but I think we've come a long way with how we deal with data, just because technology has improved and a lot of things are better that way, so I think that's good. A more direct involvement of indigenous peoples and frankly Arctic residents in general. How this next IPY is set up, I don't see very clearly how that fits into the current structure. And many scientists are wondering how they themselves can get involved. The last IPY was very bottom up, very grassroots, and I think that's why it worked so well, because everyone felt like they could be involved. And this one is a bit, let's just say, non-transparent for a lot of people. I think learning from the past is very important. Several stories here were mentioned. One of Bob Carell and the famous saving Chillingarov on his iceberg, and the Gorbachev speech, which is Ad Ragni, another wonderful leader that we lost this year. There's a lot of these great stories, and I've been working on a project with Orrin Young and unfortunately Bob, who now we lost, creating or recording their histories. And there's so many great things that we can learn from people in the past, and I hope that the people planning this next IPY have a chat with those of us involved in the last IPY. I think another place that we could have done better was action to knowledge. What was the big impact from IPY? I'm not sure we really know that yet, because we kind of missed that evaluation piece, I think. I also think that for the next IPY to be successful, we need to not just deal with science and academia, but we need to reach out to business and include especially the insurance sector, particularly sea level rise, right? They're going to really want to know what's going on with that. We're going to need another Dave Carlson. For those of you who know, Dave was an instrumental cheerleader and was really great at finding resources from nothing and putting partnerships together. And so I think that's very important. And one thing I haven't also seen, we're already talking about this IPY, but I don't think I have seen yet, and I could have missed it, but what does the world look like in 2032? We have all these projections, right? But where's the nice video or presentation that somebody can give saying, this is what the world is going to look like. This is why we need a new IPY. These are the big questions we're going to need to know. And I haven't seen that yet. And I think the scientific community really needs to put that together. We come and we say we need this IPY, but yet there's really nothing showing why we need an IPY besides the fact that we as scientists just know we need it. But in order to prove that, I think we really need some kind of Dave Carlson presentation on what it's going to be. I'm a member of the U.S. National Academy's Polar Research Board, and we're planning a workshop for May, and I know that's one of the things that we're working on. So if anyone is interested in helping with that, or if anyone knows if anyone else has done that, please let us know, because I think that would be a great resource to have as we go forward and try and convince people to fund an IPY and to get involved with it. So.
Yeah, thank you, Jenny. Just a few thoughts also. You're not a part of the organizations, but the challenge to work with Russia in the IPY, whilst many or even maybe most of the other countries is not willing or will not work with Russia. It just seems like a very big challenge. Do you have any thoughts on that?
After a few glasses of wine, I'll have a few thoughts.
Okay.
I think we also have to remember that, and I think you said it in your opening remarks, it's all about people. And we may be scientists and we may have government titles or but we're still people and we still have friends. I know sometimes it's hard to reach out to your friends in Russia, and sometimes it's not always safe for them, but I think if we try and keep those connections going, I am hopeful that at some point some sanctions will be lifted or something, and if we still have those connections, I know in Apex we tried very hard to make sure that there was a lot of young Russians involved, and so there are those connections for those people who were young researchers back in the last IPY who will now be leading institutions and things in the next IPY. So if they're able to connect with their former Russian counterparts, I see that as a huge plus. And so I do have hope that will happen. And Trump was supposed to end the war on day one, so I guess he's slacking a little. But I hope it's going to, I just hopeful, I guess.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Then we are moving on to our final panelist, Miguel Ronjero. And Miguel is an international relations officer at the European Commission's DG Mare, specializing in EU Arctic policy and multilateral negotiations. With experience in the UN and IAEA, he brings deep expertise in science, diplomacy, and international collaboration. And how have the EU strategic interests and engagements in the Arctic evolved since 2022? And what are the driving forces behind this shift?
Thank you. And well, thanks for the invitation and good afternoon to everybody. So the interests of the EU in the Arctic didn't change in 2022 or didn't change on February 2022. Already in October 2021, when we last updated the EU Arctic policy, it was clearly stated that the EU has strategic and daily interests in the Arctic, and those interests have not changed. Our interests are, first, people living in the Arctic, in particular indigenous peoples. Our interests are sustainable development that works first for those living in the Arctic, but from development that also Europe benefits, and peace and stability for the region. What happened in 2022 was an acceleration on the implementation of these goals, of these objectives. Some more accelerated than others, and some that had a relevance for the Arctic but came from outside the Arctic. So, for example, the EU in February 2022 started with a plan called Repower EU, shifting our energy sources to more reliable partners, but also working on efficiency and reducing use of energy and resources. And as a good news in that regard, last year coal was the part of the energy mix in all EU countries was the lowest one when it came to energy generation. So all renewables independently, not aggregated, but independently, now produce more electricity in the EU than coal. And this is very, very good. Gas has also gone down quite a lot. We have been working on implementing this EU Arctic policy on these interests. We have been working with local people, local communities, municipalities. We have been working with scientists, researchers through Horizon, through earlier this morning, for example, I was talking about the Mission Ocean. So this is quite important in this regard. A big number that you can argue whether the EU is a new actor, an old actor, Arctic, non-Arctic. I would say it's clearly Arctic. It's not a state, but it's clearly in the Arctic. But the EU funding for research, specifically Arctic and polar, so covering the Arctic and the Antarctic, is almost €500 million under the Horizon program. And this money is from the EU member states. So it comes from Brussels, but it's aggregated from Berlin, from Paris, from Rome, from Madrid, from Stockholm, from Helsinki. This is quite important to bear in mind. We have been working, supporting as much as we have been able to indigenous peoples, particularly Sami people and specifically the Sami Council. We have been holding regular indigenous peoples dialogue in the framework of the EU Arctic Forum. And here there is a lot to do, a lot more to do. We are fully aware of this, but we are happy to say that we are moving forward. We are walking, one step at a time, but slowly, faster, but we are moving forward, knowing that there is more to do. We have been working on the implementation of the Central Arctic Oceans Fisheries Agreement, an element that is super important for the Arctic, and an agreement that I believe, and I really believe it, this is not just notes, it's a unique agreement for how it was crafted, and because it is an agreement that puts forward a precautionary approach and science and knowledge, and here indigenous knowledge, so all knowledge. And this is unique, and this is one of the things we have been working on. So our interests have not changed. We opened the commission office in Greenland. We launched strategic partnerships with Canada and Greenland on raw materials. So all that continued, as we had said in the Arctic policy. Now, the engagement itself obviously changed, because one partner, we could not make, it was not possible to do business as usual with that partner. And that we saw as well as an opportunity to create new partnerships with countries, with players, with actors, with whom there was more limited engagement. So in that sense, we turn our eyes to Canada, to Alaska, to civil society organizations, to youth organizations, to municipal organizations, and we invested our efforts in deepening our work with them. So in that sense, I mean, also with Iceland and Norway, of course, I never should never forget the host country. But it's clear that the geostrategic importance of the Arctic has increased. I would say that it goes a little bit back. It's not, 2022 or 2021 or any particular time, or late 2024. But definitely is increasing. And it has been said here that sometimes there is genuine interest and there is a need to understand what's going on in the Arctic because it affects everywhere and everyone. But sometimes there is also an interest of, when the ice melts, there are resources here. And on this one, the EU follows and promotes a precautionary approach. And when it comes to indigenous rights, we have it very clear on the EU Arctic policy: free, prior, and informed consent for anything that happens on indigenous lands. So an acceleration, but our interests, our strategic interests, were clearly stated on the EU Arctic policy, and those have not changed. We still believe that climate change is the biggest threat to the Arctic and to the world, and that a lot of our activities, being on research, being on sustainable development, being on people-to-people cooperation, need to pivot around how do we reduce climate change, how do we adapt to climate change, how do we build resilient communities, and how do we tackle this, which is the biggest challenge that humanity has faced in millennia.
Thank you. We now will have discussions on some issues, most of which we have touched upon, but I think that needs also to move a bit further in depth on. We have discussed Arctic science, diplomacy, history, and it's important for many reasons. But do you think, and I ask you first, Melody, is a return to the pre-2022 Arctic collaboration model or structure feasible, or is a new type of framework needed?
We've talked about this before, and the question is, can we just go back in time? Can we just say pre-2022, let's all go back and start again? My own personal opinion is no, that we need to think about Arctic collaboration and Arctic science diplomacy. This is the rethinking. Go further, more knowledge co-production and co-creation between science and Arctic indigenous peoples and indigenous knowledge. We need to make these platforms. We need to think about these issues of respect and sovereignty and trust building as core, so that instead of, when we can't go back, is my opinion. That world does not exist. The world is changing. So this is the time to go all in on the things we actually hadn't been doing before 2022, and we kept saying we would. How do we really want Arctic collaboration to work? How do we want peace and sustainability to be put forward? How do we want to make sure that we are working ethically and equitably in these cooperative agreements that indeed the Arctic indigenous peoples began way back before anyone else? How do we move those forward, not just where we were in 2022, but how do we think better? And when we move towards the IPY, when we hope significant amounts of money will be put into these issues, how do those core issues, how do we move ahead again, how we do this, how we do it ethically, how do we do it equitably, how do we do it inclusively, how do we reframe science as science and indigenous knowledge, how do we reframe diplomacy as working with communities as well as these diplomatic powerhouse areas. Can we do that? So no, don't go back to pre-2022. Move it forward, invest in those those norms that we've always thought were the right way to go, and make those the basis of IPY, because just going back to where it was before is not enough.
Would you like also to comment on that, Anders?
Yes. Volker said something about we have to look at what's possible versus what is not. And I think we have to separate things from one thing from another. So we're here talking about science diplomacy. And I have to say something outright. Before I do, let me underline one thing. Let me be very clear. We do not support anything that is ongoing in Ukraine. In my language, in Sami language, we do not have a word for war. So let that be said. And let me comment on what it is I'm reflecting on. Yes, go back or not. But we experience that students with Russian background are not welcome into, for instance, the University of Tromsø. At the outbreak of the Ukraine war, there were serious discussions on expelling Russian children from football tournaments in Norway. More to our topic today, there was a suggestion to expel all Russian students from the European Union. And that was spearheaded by leading large European nations. And it begs the following reflection. If that was the answer, what was the question? And I have to say that this week you've seen we have our food lab up on the outside. And we have had many things happening. And we are in the process of, well, we've hosted a particular international organization that was very worried that for them it would be too sensitive to encounter indigenous youth with Russian backgrounds. They were really worried about that. And I have to say that we try to take care of also Russian indigenous youth here in Norway, in the West. I think it's about time someone called for a little bit of decency. We're trying to take care of them. Should we, how are we supposed to treat them here? So let's not go back, no, but let's take some step forward. What is the real question here?
Volker, would you also like to comment on that?
Yeah, no, very good point on this. Thank you. So it's a difficult thing. I mean, I don't think that we can go back to where we were easily. There's so much things destroyed and so much mistrust now. I mean, I speak about my perspective. I started my scientific career in the Russian Arctic in the early 90s. So I organized one of the first Russian-German expeditions in '94. And of course, it took us decades. There's some German colleagues sitting here and nodding, yeah. So it took us decades to build this up, and it was destroyed overnight. And of course, there is simply so much mistrust that it won't go back to where we were before. Speaking for my country, and I think it's the same for many other countries. But what you are saying, Anders, is so important, because that is not, of course, not mistrust against Russian scientists. We still have contacts, and we develop these contacts, and we talk to people. It's mistrust against the Russian government. And that is the point. And then we have to clearly distinguish that. So, and as I said, my government completely stopped institutional cooperation with Russia, but scientists are allowed or maybe even encouraged to continue the dialogue with Russian friends that we have over 30 years. Of course, you have friends there. This is very difficult for various reasons, but still it is it's important. And that's what I said when I talked about we have to see what's possible. Yeah? And there are organizations that even the Arctic Council working groups, they now have Russian members that continue to work with Russian colleagues. Though, of course, it's the same there because the political discussion does not involve Russia. So on the SAO level and on the ministerial level, of course, there's no discussion with the Russian government. But on the scientific level, it is. So the limitation, of course, that we have in terms of science diplomacy always requires some political will. And if that political will is not there, that is very difficult.
Thank you. Jenny, if you also would like to reflect on this, but I would like to urge you to think not just not just on the question, will we go back to collaborating in the Arctic with Russia, but was the system that we had prior perfect? Or as in these disruptive times, can we dare to think, big on how an ideal Arctic science collaboration with co-creation and so on could be set up?
I think,
Dream, Jenny, dream.
well, if we can dream, we can go back in time. I wouldn't have dated that cowboy in college, but we can't go back in time. I think there was always a level of distrust of data just because of the system of governance. I think we should also think about China, right? We have some distrust with China as well. So it's not just about Russia. And so there is some, distrust and trust issues there, particularly at the government level. But then I think when we get down to the people level, again, it's all about the people. And if you have this ability to have a workshop where you're, able to hang out in a Icelandic pool or something, where you can build trust in a different way and get to know people in a different way. And with the indigenous people, you know this better than I do, but you can build this level of trust that can even overcome some levels of governance, I think. So it's again all about the people and the relationships, and I don't think it's just Russia that we have a problem with. I do think now that we have good satellite data that we can back up sometimes, which helps us to verify data perhaps on some things. So there's a way to check to make sure we're getting correct information. But I do think it's about building trust and with people one-on-one.
Thank you. I would like to hear your ideas also on how the future of the Arctic relates to the past, how different it can be, and how different it might be from a European perspective, and also in a context where we see the international collaboration system, not just in the Arctic, but in general, is being reduced. And what will the EU's role in a future Arctic be in a context like that, in a more regional science collaboration context?
So I think that colleagues before me really mentioned the key elements. One is trust, and how it takes decades to build, and how you can lose it in one day, and how difficult it is to rebuild that trust again. And the other element I take is that indeed let's look forward and not just back. So let's not think, okay, why can't we go back to January 2022? No, but how can we make the next International Polar Year better than those that came before? And I like the overview you gave, because what I was also listening to is that it started with 12 countries and ends up with more than 60. So here, my take or my twist to the conversation is, how can the next International Polar Year get 80 countries, 90, 100, 150, as many countries as possible with genuine interest? I mean, one of the things I really like about my job is when I can tell scientists really obvious things. And you know, science needs to be open, and scientists build on each other's findings. So how do we make sure that from now on the way to the next International Polar Year, as many countries as possible, as many institutions as possible, contribute in an open, genuine way, so there can be as many great discoveries as those that you listed in every single one of these important moments in polar research history. So to me, that's the key thing. Now, in the shrinking space for diplomacy, your second question, I don't think it's shrinking. Diplomacy is about recognizing that you disagree with a person, with a party, with a state in front of you, but you still want to sit down and talk it out, talk it through, and reach an agreement which with you both can live. And this is the key thing. So that space has not disappeared. It might be a little bit more difficult now. Maybe, maybe not. I mean, we tend to think about our lifetime, what we have experienced, but I believe that at least today the UN is still working, and people are still talking to each other in these big organizations. States are still talking to each other, which was not necessarily the case 100 years, 200 years, 300 years ago. We still work in a world, in a setting where multilateralism and diplomacy are important. So how do we keep preserving that, and how can science show that this is the way forward?
Thank you. Now I would like to open the floor for questions to the panel. No questions or comments? Yes, please.
Thank you very much for this interesting discussion. My name is Johanna Ikavalko. I'm the director of the Arctic Center, University of Lapland. And I'm not going to be politically correct with my comments, because we all know what has happened during the past week. I myself got already 5 media interviews, media asking about our reflections to what President Trump had said about Greenland and Northwest Passage and oil drilling and so on and so forth. We all know that. So to be honest, I'm a little bit frustrated with a kind of a lame discussion. I would like to hear some radical thoughts about what to expect in the future, what comes to Arctic geopolitics that obviously affects also science diplomacy in the Arctic and also affects the Arctic Council. So give us some radical thoughts. Thank you.
Melody, would you like to be the radicalist?
Thank you. I think part of it is what you're hearing is processing. It's still very challenging. It's still, for those of us in the U.S., we're still trying to understand what is happening. I've been having these interviews too, and they ask me, so why would people, what are the minerals in Greenland? What are the? I said, that's not the question. The question is that a president-elect is discussing hostile interventions and hostile takeovers of one of our allies, a democratic ally. That's the question. And it was very frustrating to see it all about minerals and this, and it was just really hard to understand that my own country is not understanding that this is absolutely, it's abhorrent, it's awful. So it's awful. So this shouldn't be allowed. This shouldn't be happening. So it's more of the processing. I don't think any of us know. What we have been talking about, I think, is if we can't trust our own government, and others can't trust our own government. I think we thought, I can say, I'm in academia, I'm not in government, so I can say, that if we can't trust this, what do we do? And so actually the conference, I've been here for the last week, trying to brainstorm what do we do? And it obviously has to do with money, and we've actually talked about this a little bit. There needs to be some sort of fund that is almost outside. I teach science, policy, and diplomacy. It's all about money and power, and someone always has the money and someone always has the power. But could there be a fund that is separated from some of these vagaries that can allow the Arctic, and this is dream, but obviously we cannot trust where the money's coming from. We cannot trust our own government to support the norms and the important trust building that should be the basis of Arctic and then the future international polar year work. So to me, it comes back to money and power, and how do we create new networks of money and power? Thank you to Canada, the EU, the Nordics for working together, and I hope that the US will regain trust, but I don't know if and when we'll be able to do that. I'm hopeful.
Thank you, Melody. Jenny, you also had some.
I'm from
thoughts on this?
Wisconsin, which is almost Canada, so that kind of should help. I don't know. I actually think what he's doing with Greenland and the Panama Canal is clever. And the US media is just stupid enough to pick it up, because that's all everybody is talking about. And the other things that he's doing is way worse. And it's just a big smokescreen. He knows he can't buy Greenland, but what's everybody talking about? We're talking about it here. You're getting media interviews about this. It's crazy town. Everybody knows this is stupid, but that's what sells. That's what gets the ratings. And he's brilliant for doing that, frankly. I mean, I'm not a big fan of the guy, but that's smart. And maybe scientists should start thinking about something like that. What if Trump decides to be friends with Putin and the BRICS community, and it becomes, the Arctic Six, and the U.S. and Russia? I mean, there's your radical idea, right? I mean, I don't know, right? We don't know what's going to happen. I don't think that's going to happen, but who knows, really? But then maybe there's a regime change in Russia and the U.S., and then everybody comes back together and is one big happy family again. I don't know. I'm usually not a glass half full kind of gal, but that just sounded like it, didn't it? I don't know. But I think we just need to stop thinking about this buying Greenland stuff. And maybe if we can, when you get those kind of calls, just be like, this is not real. He's just making a smokescreen.
Well, I hope she's right. I'm not convinced yet. I think this may be a longer play. I used to work in government. This one seems like it has more teeth to it, and I'm worried about it. I absolutely agree it's a smokescreen. And it may have it's already destroying trust, but there's a play here, and it's about getting a better deal, but it even may go further than that. So I think everyone needs to keep their guard up. I would not suggest that it's just, I agree it's a play, and I agree it's a smokescreen, but don't put your guard down, please.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Monika Szkarłat, Meraki Skłodowska University, Polish Academy of Sciences. I have a question for the representative of the European Commission. You mentioned multilateralism and that international organizations still function. Well, of course, declaratively, legally speaking, they do. But me as a IR scholar, what I observe also, which refers to the changes in Arctic governance, is a withdrawal of the influence and power of international organizations, including EU, but especially the UN, and a reverse into power-centric international relations. Which is, of course, also well, we had decisions of the elect President Donald Trump of withdrawal the United States from WHO. We had if the scenario with Greenland, as Professor said, would happen, then it means well, a conflict within NATO or inside NATO between two members of NATO. And the EU somewhere going around this whole club of actors without any, I would say, specific influence on what happens in this whole governance changing situation. So the question is whether this multilateralism really functions.
Thank you. Very good question.
Very good, and I think yes, it does. Is it working at the ideal pace in the ideal scenario as described in books? No. Reality is different from theory. Reality is different from research. And the fact is that, multilateralism has been hit, but it's not down. And this is the important thing. And even if, we can think, and, with legitimate reasons to do so, well, the UN is not working as well as it should, or this particular treaty is not being, implemented as fast, or now, you mentioned WHO and the President's Trump decision to withdraw from that, which is going to affect the organization, obviously. So that's correct, but there is still a lot of parties to WHO. The UN is still delivering in many areas, and multilateralism is still working in many, many ways. It could be at more regional level. Multilateralism within the EU as such is very well alive. It's as alive as it could be, and it's as functioning as it could be. And we can also see that that way of doing things in other areas. The African Union, ASEAN, is also working in that sense. Now, if we focus on what one country, any given country, say the US, for example, is doing or doesn't, then, we are filtering all our understanding through that particular lens. And this is, then through that, I agree that then things might look a little bit bleak. But we need to understand that multilateralism is not about what one single country does or doesn't. It's about the international community gathering together and deciding we are going to solve our problems collectively and by talking, and not by proving that I'm stronger than you. And this is the key thing. This is what we believe. I mean, we in the EU, me as an individual, and I'm sure that most of you, if not all of you, believe that it's about that, and this is the key thing. It's not really like, the happiest times, I would agree, and I'm personally more worried about climate change and its impacts than I am about other things, but you can pick your poison at the bar. But there's still hope. When it comes to multilateralism, I think that it's working. It might be working better now at regional level than at global level. Okay, let's focus on that. And let's move from that to the global level as well, back to the global level. So hang on there.
Thank you. Anders, you have a comment on Greenland.
Yes, I'm a slow thinker. I'm sorry. Well, so I have to say that I personally thought that Trump was mildly entertaining up to the point when the Congress was stormed. So I'm not a particular fan myself, but is anyone in this room questioning whether or not he's a legally elected president of the US? Raise your hand. No. So that's how it is. Now, I don't know if you want to have discussions on your political system in the US. Maybe that's called for, I don't know. But reindeer herders, we are realists. This is the situation. Now, what could be the rationale behind his thinking on Greenland? Seeing as how Greenlanders are about to gain independence. Does he trust self-determination in Greenland? Knowing that the real competition, when we look ahead, is not US-Russia, it's US-China. I'm just asking. I'm a simple reindeer herder. I have no answers. But these are lingering questions. So, of course, we are now way past science diplomacy. Apologize for that. But since our colleagues in Rovaniemi wanted radical answers, or rather maybe questions was all I had. So those are some of my thoughts on this. Thank you.
Thank you. And in the Arctic, well, maybe especially in the Arctic, everything is connected to everything. We have time for one final question. Okay, in the back there.
Thank you very much. My name is Jorda Stradowski from the Norwegian Meteorological Institute, and I have a question that concerns the United Nations organizations. So I take part in the Congress and the Executive Council meetings of the World Meteorological Organization, and we can really, in a way, quite nicely there also communicate across these geopolitical borders. I mean, it's many countries of the world who are there. And we do see that we can reach many countries there, and that also gives me hope. For example, for the International Polar Year, we see actually support for polar issues from countries all around the world, countries that are not close to the poles, countries that are worried, for example, about sea level rise. So I would be very interested to hear your perspective about how the UN organizations can maybe be used even better, how we can, I mean, they can, of course, not do everything, but how can we maybe use that better, that there is a way to communicate and act and decide across those geopolitical borders? So your perspectives would be much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you. Volker, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, no, very good point, and that's exactly what I meant when I said we have to see what's possible and where cooperation is still working. And WMO, of course, is a good example. And WMO also played a key role actually in the last IPY, actually in all IPYs. So it was always WMO, and the other organization that was involved is ICSU, the International Science Council. Now they're called ICS, I think, Science Council. And they also, of course, still have Russian membership, and they still work with Russian scientists. So. And that, of course, is a way of keeping some level of cooperation also in the IPY by involving those organizations like WMO, like ICSU, also in the Antarctic. In the Antarctic, Russia is still participating in the meetings. There are other problems that occur in the Antarctic, but still there is a dialogue. The thing that I think we have to be aware of is that really institutional cooperation between at least the European and I guess a few other countries with Russia will simply not work, but there are possibly ways to move around that with involving those kind of organizations that you mentioned.
Thank you. Okay, if there's one short question in the back there also, I saw that we have just time for that.
Hi, I hope it's short. I don't know if it is, but my name's Erica. I'm an Arctic policy analyst in the Canadian government. And on the talk of multilateralism and working with non-Arctic states, I guess my question is, from a member of an Arctic state, how do we protect our land when we're working with countries who may consider the Arctic as a global commons rather than belonging to the 8 Arctic littoral states?
I can just quickly, on that one from the European Union perspective, to highlight, and I know we are short of time and there are other colleagues who want to intervene, that for the EU, and this is very clearly stated also in our Arctic policy, the primary responsibility of development of what happens in the Arctic is with the Arctic states.
It's the same in the German Arctic policy.
And it's been my experience coordinating international science organizations for almost 20 years now that it's often the non-Arctic states that have more of a concern for the people in the Arctic itself than some of the Arctic governments. And again, we'll go back to Trump here, but I would disagree with that.
Melody also. You would
Just
like to
a last piece is that there are things that haven't gone into force, and I don't think they will in this time and world, but there are folks who have put out protocols on things like Arctic Investment Protocol and discussions that you shouldn't be, to even have, it's not a global commons, and to be able to come in and work with people, it is on the Arctic people's terms, and that is what Greenland's government has been saying so wonderfully clearly with support from Denmark. So more of that. And that there are strong guidelines for the way you behave and build trust in your monetary systems, in your engagement in the Arctic. And those are those norms I was mentioning. How do we strengthen them? Because I will say, I'm such a huge fan of multilateralism, and I've been in conversations where I'm hearing that we're all going back to I think it's the 19th century, a real leader is a man who goes and takes things. That's not a world I want to live in. And how do we stand up against that with the norms and the institutions we've created in the Arctic and around the world? I honestly think that's a huge question for all of us. And it is why, still processing, we're in a place where I think all of these things we hold dear are at a crossroads, to get to our opening title. And I don't think we can stand by and watch it. We have to be planning right now of how we ensure those norms are fast and strong, and that we stand up against bullying, fascism, and autocracy and oligarchy. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. That's I think that's a great a good way to put this issue to make that point clear. Before we end this panel, I would like to give you all 1 minute, to say what an ideal science collaboration system would look like by 2032, and how we can get there. And now we have been discussing this all day, but just give me some very overarching ideas.
May I take the floor, as I have to run in a few minutes?
Yes.
Well, thank you very much. Perfect system, that I don't know, but to have a true respect for the Arctic indigenous people's knowledge system, that would come in very handy. Can't resist but to reflect on what was mentioned on free, prior and informed consent concerning the EU. And since, Melody, you mentioned the Arctic Investment Protocol, that very instrument undermines what has been achieved in recognition of indigenous people's rights, which is the direct reason why I resigned from the governing board of the Arctic Economic Council, just to say. So that does not make a good example for me. But yes, we believe in multilateralism, we believe in dialogue, more of it, not less. And let's see what happens,
Thank you for just giving the mic to talk. And
I hope you will forgive me, I will have to leave. But thank you to the fellow panelists and Mr. Chair and the audience.
Thank you, Anders, and give him a short applause over here.
So maybe I should give you my standard answer for those kind of questions. So that question is so good, I don't want to ruin it with an answer. So no, it's. I know this is it's very hard. We talked about that a lot. So, and there are things which we would wish to have, and things that are realistic. And I think we have to be realistic. Of course, I would wish to have the same kind of cooperation that we had before, with something like a mosaic expedition and all these kind of things that we had in the last IPY. But that is not realistic. So I would hope that if we have this IPY, we at least have the cooperation and we have everyone on board somehow, yeah, in whatever way. And I think that's already challenging. Yeah? And then I don't think that an IPY that is split into two. Let's say there's maybe a Western IPY projects and then there are Russian-Chinese IPY projects working in parallel, and then at the end somebody puts that together. I don't think this is an ideal solution. So there must be some ways in between of finding a way to get everyone somehow involved and to get data from everywhere, and that's, I think, important. Yeah.
Thank you. Jenny, please.
I think Taylor Swift has to become the ambassador for Arctic research, and then everybody in the world is going to be excited about it.
Okay. Miguel?
It's impossible to come after that one. I think it has to be, again, it's really difficult to come. No, okay. It has to be inclusive. It has to be participative. It has to be based on trust, built on trust. And it has to be to the benefit of those living in the Arctic and to the benefit of mankind, of humankind. That's it. If we achieve that, I think it will be an excellent International Polar Year.
Thank you. And Melody?
I think I may have said before, but yeah, and it's very hard to, the Taylor Swift comment. No, I think this is, I've said what is the most important thing right now is recognizing what brought us all to these fora is, it's unique. I've been in governance worlds with the UN, the International Science Council, and to see science diplomacy done in the Arctic with the respect of diverse knowledge systems, with consensus negotiation, with really investing in people and communities is something I hope we fight for. And as I think you heard me allude to, sadly, I think it's now going to be more of a fight, and I don't know how to do that yet. I don't know how we stand up for these norms, and we don't just say, well, they need to be in the IPY, and we need to, so we'll keep doing what we're doing, but I think we need to recognize that there are forces that are really hoping that some of these cooperative and trust-building engagements and multilateralism are not in some people's interest, and we need to be aware of that and on guard and find the ways to strengthen our structures.
Miguel, Jenny, Volker, Melody, thank you for sharing your thoughts with us in this panel today, and thank you very much to the audience for taking the time. Have a great Arctic Frontiers.